Hi, my name is Lydia Nicolai, and I'm a student at West Virginia University majoring in environmental geoscience. Today I'm going to briefly go over the effects of mottled water deficits on the growth of Appalachian tree species. And the importance of this idea is to add to the understanding of climate change and the effects that it can have specifically on the Appalachian region. We know that climate change can create species loss, and we were curious about the role of water in that. So we used the data we collected in Glenjean, West Virginia at the Summit Metro Reserve to test how the growth of different tree species differed by mottled water deficits. And we thought, where we expected that smaller trees would be in areas of larger water deficit. And we can see these ridges and valleys here expressed on this map. We'll talk about them a little bit more later, but those ridges and valleys create microclimates that creates variability in the mottled water deficits that we created. So for all the data we collected, we had to measure the bearing and the distance of each tree, the tree size, using DBH, which is diameter at rest height, and that will be our proxy for tree growth, because true tree growth is pretty hard to determine. And then we also had to identify each tree by species. To get the figures we needed for our mottled water deficit, we used GIS. We use the solar radiation tool in GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, and that tool accounts for the variation in topography of those valleys and ridges that we saw in Figure 1, the shading from the hills and the different slope angles. And just to clarify what I'm talking about by water deficit here, that is when the water demand is exceeding the supply. And we can see that deficit expressed here in this graph, this shaded area, this line shaded area. Is all area of deficit where the demand is exceeding the supply. And the difference between the north and south facing slope is right here, the smaller shaded area, the orange being the south facing slope and the lighter blue being the north facing slope. And so this is just another example or explanation of how the sun drives different water demands between different microclimates and slopes. When we were beginning to compare tree size and species, we were looking at them all as a whole, and we only included 19 out of the 28 of them due to some of the sample sizes just not being large enough for us to be comfortable making any conclusions about. So this is the 19 out of the 28 that we did conclude with sample size that were large enough. And when we were looking at, or when we began comparing all the 19 tree species and their DBH, their tree growth, we didn't really see a significant relationship. It wasn't until we started to break apart these species on an individual level and look at their relationship with water deficit and tree growth by DBH that we started to see our expected relationships form. And we can see that expressed in this shagbark hickory species, where these smaller trees are in fact showing to be more prevalent in these larger areas of water deficit. And the only tree species that did the opposite of what we expected was this black cherry tree, where the larger trees were actually in the areas of larger water deficit, which was pretty interesting. And this black oak species, this is a great example of what a lot of the tree species showed originally. It originally showed a pretty weak relationship, not very significant. It wasn't until we included only the tree sizes with a DBH that was larger than 30 centimeters that the relationship improved, and it showed us more of what we were expecting. And we did that because trees smaller than 30 centimeters are most likely saplings and aren't tall enough to reach the canopy. And so what does all this mean? This means that we will most likely see a majority of the tree species continue to benefit from this from the wetter environment that's predicted in the new Appalachian climate, and that the south-facing ridge tops with that experience more solar radiation, they'll potentially serve as an area of refugia for certain tree species that just aren't able to thrive in the wetter climate. Tree species like black cherry that we saw in the past figure. And future research can be done to get a better idea about the age and the growth of this forest, and we can do that using tree ring samples. And just a quick thanks to the Summit Metro Reserve for their hospitality as we did this research, NSF, ASF, Eberly College, and the SURE program, and of course the Smithsonian Forest Geo Network.